The blood had soaked through her skirts and pooled in small crimson circles on the rough wooden planks beneath her. But Eliza Brennan kept scrubbing because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering that 6 months ago she had been a schoolteacher with clean hands and a future. Not a woman whose knees bled into the floorboards of the Red Desert Saloon in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, in the summer of 1878. The bristles of the brush scraped against the wood with a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing, back and forth, while the Saturday afternoon sun slanted through the dirty windows and painted everything the color of old whiskey. Her dark hair had come loose from its bun hours ago, hanging in damp strands around her face, and her arms ached with a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep ever seemed to cure. The saloon owner, Marcus Thornton, demanded perfection in his floors even if he cared nothing for the woman who scrubbed them. And Eliza had learned in her first week that any section left less than spotless meant no payment at all and possibly a blow to the side of the head that would leave her ears ringing for days. She had not meant to end up here. 6 months ago, she had stepped off the train from Boston with her teaching certificate and a letter of employment from the Cheyenne School Board, ready to bring education to the frontier and make her late mother proud. But the letter had been a forgery, created by a man who made his living selling false promises to educated Eastern women. And by the time Eliza discovered the truth, she had no money for a return ticket and no family to wire for help. Her father had died when she was 12, her mother 2 years later, and the aunt who had raised her had made it clear that Eliza's decision to go west was a betrayal that severed all family ties. So she had taken the only work available to a woman alone in a frontier town with no references and no connections. She cleaned the saloon from dawn until the customers arrived in the evening, then she cleaned the boarding house down the street until midnight, and then she collapsed into the narrow bed in the storage room that Marcus Thornton allowed her to use in lieu of part of her wages. It was not a life. It was survival, measured out in buckets of dirty water and floors that would only be soiled again within hours. Her left knee gave a sharp throb of pain, and Eliza looked down to see that the fabric of her skirt had worn through completely in that spot, the skin beneath scraped raw and bleeding freely now. She had no money for new fabric, no time to mend what she had, and the knowledge that she would be on these same knees tomorrow and the day after that, and the day after that stretched before her like a prison sentence with no end. "Dear God," she whispered, and was startled to hear her own voice crack with desperation. She never prayed anymore. Prayer was for people who believed someone was listening. The saloon doors swung open behind her with a creak of hinges, and Eliza tensed. Marcus Thornton often came back in the afternoon to check her work, and if he found her pausing, even for a moment, there would be consequences. She plunged the brush back into the bucket and scrubbed harder, ignoring the way fresh blood smeared across the clean wood. But the footsteps that crossed the floor were not Marcus Thornton's heavy, deliberate tread. These steps were lighter, quicker, and they stopped directly beside her. Eliza kept her eyes on the floor, kept scrubbing, because looking up at the customers only brought trouble. Men who came into saloons did not see cleaning women as human beings. They saw obstacles or opportunities, and neither option had ever ended well for her. "Ma'am, your knees are bleeding." The voice was low and quiet, with an accent that spoke of Texas or maybe further south, and there was something in it that made Eliza's hands still on the brush despite her best intentions. She looked up slowly, squinting against the sunlight behind the speaker, and saw a man standing above her in worn denim and dusty leather, a dark hat shadowing a face that looked to be somewhere in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most. He was tall and lean in the way of men who spent their lives on horseback, and his eyes, when she finally met them, were a startling clear gray that reminded her of winter storms over the Atlantic. "I am working," Eliza said, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. "Please move so I can finish this section." The man did not move, Instead, he crouched down beside her, and Eliza instinctively leaned away, her heart suddenly pounding, but he did not reach for her. He simply looked at her bleeding knees, then at the brush in her hands, then at her face with an expression she could not quite read. "How long have you been scrubbing today?" he asked. "That is none of your concern." Eliza dipped the brush back into the bucket, but her hands were shaking now and water slopped over the sides. "Please, I need to finish before Mr. Thornton returns." "Thornton." The man said the name like a curse. "He owns this place." "Yes, and he will be angry if he finds me talking to customers instead of working." Eliza started scrubbing again, desperate to get this stranger to leave before Marcus returned. "Please go away." For a long moment, the man said nothing. Then, so quickly that Eliza had no time to react, he reached down and pulled her to her feet. She gasped in shock and pain as her weight came down on her damaged knees, and she would have fallen if the man had not been holding her upright with his hands firm on her arms. He was stronger than she had expected, strong enough to lift her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. And for a terrifying moment, Eliza thought she had been wrong about the kindness she had heard in his voice, that this was just another man taking what he wanted. But then he said, "No more," and there was such finality in those two words that Eliza stopped struggling and simply stared at him. "What? No more," he repeated, and this time she heard the anger beneath the quiet, not anger at her but at something else, something bigger. "You are not scrubbing another floor on bleeding knees, not today, not ever." Eliza laughed, and it came out bitter and broken. "I do not think you understand how this works. I need this job, I need to eat, I need a place to sleep. Your outrage is very noble, but it does not change reality." "Then we will change reality." The man released her arms but stayed close, as if afraid she would collapse without his support. "My name is James Cordell. I run cattle about 20 miles north of here, and I came into town today to hire a housekeeper. My last one married a rancher over in Laramie and left 3 weeks ago, and I have been living in chaos ever since. The job pays $30 a month plus room and board, and I can promise you that it does not involve bleeding on the floor." Eliza stared at him, waiting for the catch, for the moment when he would explain what services he really expected from a live-in housekeeper. She had heard these offers before, always from men who smiled too much and stood too close, and she had learned that the only safe response was refusal. But James Cordell was not smiling. He was watching her with those storm-gray eyes, patient and serious, and there was something in his face that reminded her of her father, who had been a good man in a world that did not always reward goodness. "Why?" she asked finally. "You know nothing about me." "I could be a terrible housekeeper. I could be a thief." "Are you a thief?" "No." "Do you know how to cook and clean and manage a household?" "Yes." Eliza had run her aunt's house for 5 years before coming west. She knew how to do all of those things and more. "Then that is all I need to know." James glanced down at her bleeding knees again, and his jaw tightened. "Pack whatever you have. We leave in an hour." "I cannot just leave. Mr. Thornton will. I will deal with Thornton." James cut her off, and now there was steel in his voice that had not been there before. "Go pack." Eliza wanted to argue. She wanted to explain all the reasons why this was impossible, why she could not simply walk away from her life here no matter how terrible it was, why accepting help from a stranger was dangerous and foolish and would only lead to more trouble. But her knees were bleeding, her hands were raw, and she was so desperately tired that the thought of one more day scrubbing Marcus Thornton's floors made her want to walk into the street and never stop walking. So instead of arguing, she nodded once, gathered up her bucket and brush with trembling hands, and walked toward the storage room where she slept. Behind her, she heard James Cordell settle into one of the chairs to wait, and she knew with absolute certainty that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet understand. The storage room was barely large enough for the narrow bed and the small trunk that held everything Eliza owned in the world. She knelt, wincing at the pain in her knees, and opened the trunk with hands that still shook. Inside were 2 dresses, both worn but clean. A spare set of undergarments, a hairbrush that had been her mother's, and the teaching certificate that now seemed like a relic from someone else's life. She packed everything into a canvas bag, then paused, looking around the cramped space that had been her home for 6 months. She should feel something, she thought. Sadness or nostalgia, or at least some sense of leaving something behind. But all she felt was a desperate relief, and an equally desperate fear that James Cordell would change his mind before she made it back to the main room. When she emerged with her bag, James was standing near the bar, his arms crossed over his chest, staring at something on the wall. As Eliza approached, she realized he was looking at the liquor prices that Marcus had painted in careful letters above the shelves of bottles. There was something in his expression that she could not quite name, a kind of weary disgust that suggested he had seen too many saloons and too many men like Marcus Thornton. "I am ready," Eliza said quietly, and James turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Good, my horse is outside. We can ride double until we get to the ranch, and then I will send one of my men back for supplies. Mr. Cordell, I need to be clear about something." Eliza straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to meet his eyes even though every instinct told her to look away. "If you are expecting anything beyond housekeeping, you should say so now. I will not be taken advantage of again." James looked at her for a long moment, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes, followed by something that might have been sadness. "I am offering you a job, miss. I do not even know your name, Brennan. Eliza Brennan. I am offering you a job, Miss Brennan, nothing more and nothing less. You will have your own room with a lock on the door. You will be paid on the 1st of every month. And if at any point you are unhappy or uncomfortable, I will bring you back to town and pay you for whatever time you worked. I give you my word." His word. As if that meant something in a world where men's words were usually worth less than the breath it took to speak them. But Eliza found herself believing him anyway, or perhaps she simply wanted to believe him so badly that she ignored the small voice of caution in the back of her mind. "All right," she said, "but I would prefer it if you called me Eliza, not Miss Brennan. Miss Brennan was a schoolteacher in Boston." "I am not her anymore. Eliza, then, and you can call me James." He picked up her bag before she could protest, carrying it as easily as if it weighed nothing, and gestured toward the door. "Shall we go before Thornton returns?" They were halfway across the floor when the saloon doors slammed open and Marcus Thornton strode in, his face already red with anger. He was a thick man in his 50s, with small eyes and hands that were always curled into fists, and the sight of him made Eliza's stomach clench with familiar fear. "Where the hell do you think you are going?" Marcus demanded, his eyes fixed on Eliza. "You have not finished the floors." "Miss Brennan is leaving your employment," James said before Eliza could respond. He moved slightly, placing himself between her and Marcus, and his voice stayed calm but carried a warning that even Marcus seemed to recognize. "I am hiring her as my housekeeper." "The hell you are." Marcus took a step forward, and Eliza could smell the whiskey on him even from several feet away. "She owes me for the room I have been providing. She does not leave until that debt is paid." "I owe you nothing," Eliza said, finding her voice despite the fear. "You said the room was part of my wages. That was before you decided to quit without notice. Now it is money owed." Marcus's hand shot out toward Eliza's arm, but James moved faster, catching Marcus's wrist in a grip that made the older man wince. "She does not owe you anything," James said quietly. "And if you touch her, you will regret it." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, and Eliza held her breath, certain that violence was about to erupt. But then Marcus yanked his arm free and stepped back, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "Fine, take her. She is a terrible worker anyway, always slowing down, always complaining. But do not come crying to me when you find out what kind of woman she really is." He spat on the floor Eliza had just cleaned. "Girls who come west alone are always running from something." Eliza felt her face burn with shame and anger, but before she could respond, James had already turned away, dismissing Marcus as if he were not worth another moment of attention. "Come on, Eliza," he said, and there was a gentleness in his voice that made her throat tighten. "Let us get out of here." She followed him out into the bright afternoon sunlight, her bag over his shoulder and her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. A beautiful bay horse stood tied to the hitching post, and James secured her bag to the saddle before turning back to her. "Have you ridden much?" he asked. "Not since I was a child." Eliza looked at the horse, which suddenly seemed impossibly tall. "My father used to take me riding in the countryside outside Boston. It will come back to you." James untied the reins and swung up into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had spent his whole life on horseback. Then he held out his hand to Eliza. "Put your foot in the stirrup and I will pull you up. You will sit in front of me." Eliza hesitated, acutely aware that this meant sitting pressed against a man she had known for less than an hour. But the alternative was staying in Cheyenne, staying with Marcus Thornton, and that was no alternative at all. She took James's hand, surprised by the calluses on his palm and the strength in his grip, and let him pull her up into the saddle. She ended up seated sideways in front of him, his arms coming around her on either side to hold the reins, and it was strange and uncomfortable and oddly safe all at once. She could feel the warmth of his chest against her back, smell the scents of leather and horse and something like sage, and when the horse started forward, she instinctively leaned back against him to keep her balance. "Are you all right?" James asked, his voice close to her ear. "Yes," Eliza said, and was surprised to find that it was true. Her knees still hurt, her hands still ached, and she had no idea what kind of future she was riding toward. But for the first time in 6 months, she was not scrubbing a floor until her knees bled. For the first time in 6 months, someone had looked at her and seen a person worth helping. It was enough. They rode north out of Cheyenne, leaving the town behind as the horse settled into an easy lope that ate up the miles. The landscape opened up around them, all rolling grassland and distant mountains, and Eliza found herself relaxing despite everything. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, the wind smelled of sage and wildflowers, and James was a steady, silent presence behind her, asking nothing and offering nothing but the comfort of his certainty. After a while, he said, "You mentioned you were supposed to be a schoolteacher. What happened?" Eliza considered lying or deflecting, but she was tired of lies and tired of shame. "I was deceived. A man in Boston sold me a forged letter of employment, and I did not discover it was fake until after I had spent all my money traveling here. By then, it was too late to go back, and I had no one to help me. Your family, dead or estranged." Eliza watched a hawk circle overhead, its wings dark against the blue sky. "My parents died when I was young and my aunt raised me, but she did not approve of my decision to come west. She said I was throwing away a perfectly good future to chase some romantic notion of adventure. I suppose she was right." "She was not right." James's voice was firm. "You came here for a better life. The fact that someone took advantage of you does not make you foolish, it makes them criminals." "Perhaps." Eliza shifted slightly, trying to ease the pressure on her sore knees. "But it does not change the result." "No, but the result is not finished yet." James nodded toward the horizon. "That is my land starting just beyond those cottonwoods. 3,000 acres of grass and trouble, and a house that desperately needs a woman's touch." Eliza looked where he was pointing and saw a line of trees marking what was probably a creek, and beyond that, miles and miles of open range. "You run this ranch alone." "I have 4 men who work for me, good men who have been with me since I started this operation 5 years ago. We run about 800 head of cattle, and we are growing every year. It is not fancy, but it is mine, bought with money I earned and sweat I shed." There was pride in his voice, the kind of pride that came from building something real. "I came out here from Texas after the war with nothing but a horse and a saddle, and now I have this. It is not everything, but it is something. The war." Eliza did some quick mental arithmetic. You must have been very young. 15 when I enlisted, 19 when it ended. James's voice went flat. Too young to understand what I was fighting for, old enough to learn how to kill. But that was a long time ago, and I am trying to be a different man now. Eliza heard the weight of old pain in those words and decided not to press further. Everyone who had lived through the war carried scars, visible or otherwise, and she had no right to pick at his. Instead, she asked, "What happened to your previous housekeeper? You said she married, Sarah." "Yes, she married Tom Fletcher, who has a ranch near Laramie. They are good for each other, and I am happy for her, but it left me in a difficult position." James guided the horse around a cluster of rocks. "I am not much of a cook, and my men are even worse. We have been living on beans and bad coffee for 3 weeks, and the house looks like a tornado went through it. I was going to put an advertisement in the Cheyenne newspaper, but then I walked into that saloon and saw you. And decided to rescue me, decided to offer you a better option." James corrected, "You rescued yourself by saying yes." They rode in silence for a while longer, and Eliza found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, all open sky and endless grass, and she could understand why someone like James would choose to make a life here. There was freedom in all this space, room to breathe and think and become whoever you wanted to be. The sun was lowering toward the mountains when they finally topped a rise, and Eliza saw the ranch spread out below them. The house was larger than she had expected, a sturdy 2-story structure built of wood and stone, with a wide porch and windows that caught the golden light. Near it stood a barn, a bunkhouse, and several corrals where horses grazed peacefully. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney, and she could see a few men moving around, tending to evening chores. "It is beautiful," Eliza said, and meant it. "It is home." James urged the horse down the slope toward the buildings. "Come on, I will introduce you to the men and show you your room. Then, if you are feeling up to it, perhaps you could do something about supper. We are all fairly desperate at this point." Despite everything, Eliza found herself smiling. "I think I can manage that." The men came out to meet them as James rode into the yard, and Eliza felt herself tense again, old fears rising up. But the 4 cowboys who gathered around the horse looked more curious than threatening, their faces weathered and kind beneath their hats. "Boys, this is Eliza Brennan," James said as he dismounted and then helped her down, his hands careful on her waist. "She is going to be our new housekeeper, and I expect you to treat her with respect and keep your language clean when she is around." "Eliza, these troublemakers are Miguel, Charlie, Frank, and young Tom." The men nodded and murmured greetings, and Eliza found herself relaxing slightly. Miguel was older, maybe 50, with silver threading through his dark hair and laugh lines around his eyes. Charlie and Frank looked to be in their 30s, both lean and sunburned, and young Tom was barely 20, with the kind of eager friendliness that reminded her of a puppy. "Ma'am, it is a pleasure to meet you," Miguel said with a slight Spanish accent. "We have been hoping James would find someone to take over the cooking. His biscuits could be used as ammunition." "That is because you are supposed to add water to the flour," Charlie added, and the other men laughed. James shook his head, but Eliza could see he was fighting a smile. "Get back to work, all of you, and Miguel, can you take care of my horse? I want to show Eliza the house before it gets dark." "Of course, boss." Miguel took the reins, and the other men drifted back toward their chores, though Eliza could feel their curious glances following her. James retrieved her bag from the saddle and led her toward the house, climbing the porch steps and pushing open the front door. "I apologize in advance for the state of things," he said. "Like I said, we have been living like barbarians." Eliza stepped inside and had to suppress a laugh. The main room was indeed chaotic, with dirty dishes stacked on every surface, clothes draped over chairs, and what looked like a saddle sitting in the middle of the floor for no apparent reason. But beneath the mess, she could see the bones of a good house, with solid furniture, a large stone fireplace, and windows that let in plenty of light. "It is not that bad," she lied diplomatically. You are a terrible liar, but I appreciate the effort. James set her bag down and gestured toward a staircase. Your room is upstairs, second door on the right. It has a bed, a dresser, and a washstand, and like I said, there is a lock on the door. My room is at the end of the hall, and the other 2 bedrooms are empty. The kitchen is through there, and the washroom is out back. Take whatever time you need to settle in, and then we can talk about your duties and how you want to organize things. Eliza picked up her bag, suddenly feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. Thank you, James, for all of this. I know I said it before, but I need you to know I mean it. You do not need to keep thanking me. James met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. You are doing me a favor by taking this job. A house is not a home without someone to care for it, and I have been living in a shell for too long. There was more meaning in those words than just the literal, Eliza thought, but she was too tired to untangle it now. So she simply nodded and climbed the stairs, her knees protesting every step, until she reached the second door on the right and pushed it open. The room was simple but clean, with a real bed covered in a quilt, a dresser with a mirror above it, and a window that looked out over the ranch. After 6 months in a storage room barely big enough to turn around in, it seemed like a palace. Eliza set her bag on the bed, then walked to the window and looked out at the land stretching away toward the mountains. She had come west looking for a new life, and she had found suffering and exploitation instead. But now, standing in this clean room in this solid house on this beautiful land, she thought that maybe, just maybe, she might get a second chance at the future she had dreamed of. It was a fragile hope, as delicate as spun glass, but it was more than she had felt in a very long time. Eliza turned away from the window and unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her brush and hairpins on the dresser. Then she washed her face and hands in the basin, wincing as the water stung her scraped knees, and changed into her cleaner dress. She braided her hair and pinned it up, trying to look like someone who had not spent the morning bleeding onto a saloon floor. When she came back downstairs, she found James sitting at the table, sorting through what looked like account books. He looked up as she entered and smiled, and Eliza was struck again by how different he was from the men she had encountered in Cheyenne. There was a quietness to him, a sense of deep water running under a calm surface, and she found herself wanting to know what lay beneath. Feeling better? He asked. Much. Eliza looked around the chaotic kitchen and rolled up her sleeves. Now, let us see what I can do about feeding you and your men. What supplies do you have? Beans, flour, salt pork, and coffee, mostly. Some dried apples and a few cans of tomatoes. Sarah used to order more variety from town, but we have been making do. Making do poorly, from what Miguel suggested. Eliza opened cupboards and took stock of what was available. It was not much, but she had learned to make meals out of less during her time with her aunt. I can make a stew with the salt pork and tomatoes, and biscuits that will not double as weapons. But tomorrow, someone needs to go into town for proper supplies. I will send Charlie in the morning with a list. James stood and moved toward the door. I should let you work. Just ring the bell on the porch when supper is ready and the men will come, James. Eliza turned to face him, suddenly needing to ask the question that had been nagging at her since they left Cheyenne. Why did you really help me today? You could have hired any woman in town. Why someone you found scrubbing a saloon floor? James was quiet for a long moment, his hand on the doorframe, his eyes fixed on something far away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. My mother used to scrub floors like that back in Texas before the war. My father drank away everything we had, and she worked herself to death trying to keep us fed. I was 12 when she died, and I swore then that if I ever had the power to help someone in that situation, I would. When I saw you today, bleeding and still working, I saw her, and I could not walk away. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, moved by the raw honesty in his words. I am sorry about your mother, so am I, but maybe some good can come from it if helping you helps her memory. James tipped his hat to her, a gesture that was both courtly and somehow sad. "Welcome to the Cordell Ranch, Eliza. I hope you find some peace here." Then he was gone, leaving Eliza alone in the kitchen with her thoughts and a growing sense that she had stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple job. But there was no time to dwell on it now. She had hungry men to feed and a new life to begin, so she pushed up her sleeves and got to work. The stew came together slowly, the salt pork sizzling in the big cast-iron pot, the tomatoes adding their acidity to the beans and onions she found in a basket by the door. The biscuits were easier, her hands remembering the rhythm of cutting butter into flour even though it had been months since she had baked. By the time the sun was setting and the kitchen was filled with good smells, Eliza felt something close to contentment settling into her bones. She rang the bell as instructed, and within minutes the men came trooping in, their faces lighting up when they saw the table she had set. It was nothing fancy, just stew and biscuits and coffee, but after weeks of their own cooking it must have seemed like a feast. "Ma'am, you are a saint," young Tom said around a mouthful of biscuit, and the other men laughed and agreed. Eliza found herself smiling as she served them, pouring coffee and making sure everyone had enough. It felt good to be useful again, to be appreciated for her skills rather than simply endured. And when James caught her eye across the table and nodded his thanks, she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. After supper, the men drifted back to the bunkhouse full and content, and Eliza began the work of cleaning up. James stayed to help, carrying dishes and drying while she washed, and they worked in comfortable silence for a while. "You did not have to stay," Eliza said eventually. "I can manage this on my own, I know, but it seems wrong to make you clean up after your first day." James set a dried plate on the stack. "Besides, this gives me a chance to explain how things work around here." "All right, explain." "Breakfast is at dawn before the men ride out. Lunch they usually take with them, just biscuits and jerky. Supper is at sunset. Beyond the cooking and cleaning, you are free to organize your time however you want. If you need anything from town, make a list, and one of the men will fetch it. And if you ever feel unsafe or uncomfortable, you come to me immediately. Is that clear?" "Very clear." Eliza scrubbed at a stubborn spot on a pot. "What about my wages? You said $30 a month paid on the first, and before you ask, no, I do not expect you to pay for your room and board." "That is part of the job." James set down the towel and turned to face her. "Eliza, I need you to understand something. I am not Marcus Thornton. I am not going to cheat you or hurt you or expect anything beyond what we agreed to. I know you have no reason to trust me yet, but I hope that will change with time." "I want to trust you," Eliza admitted quietly, "but trust is difficult when it has been used against you so many times. I understand, so I will not ask you to trust me. I will just show you day after day that I am worthy of it, and eventually, maybe you will believe it." He said it so simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and Eliza found herself blinking back tears for the second time that day. She had forgotten that there were still good men in the world, men who kept their word and treated women with respect, and the reminder was almost more than she could bear. "Thank you," she whispered, and this time James did not tell her to stop thanking him. He just nodded and picked up the towel again, and they finished the dishes together as the night settled in around them. The days fell into a rhythm after that, steady and sure as the seasons. Eliza woke before dawn to start breakfast, feeding the men before they rode out to check the cattle or mend fences or do whatever mysterious work that ranching required. Then she cleaned the house, room by room, scrubbing away the layers of neglect until the wood floors gleamed and the windows sparkled. She baked bread and mended clothes and planted a small garden near the kitchen door, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil. And slowly, carefully, she began to heal. Her knees stopped bleeding and started to scar over, the raw patches fading to pale pink and then to white lines that would always be there but no longer hurt. Her hands lost their constant ache, the cuts and scrapes healing until her palms were smooth again. She put on weight, her face filling out and her dresses starting to fit the way they were meant to. And when she looked in the mirror now, she saw someone who looked alive again rather than just surviving. James kept his word about everything. He paid her on the first of the month, counting out the money in crisp bills and never asking what she did with it. He never entered her room without knocking first. He never touched her except when absolutely necessary, and even then it was always careful and respectful. His hands brief on her elbow when he helped her down from the wagon, or his fingers barely brushing hers when he handed her a cup of coffee. But despite his careful distance, Eliza found herself noticing things about him. The way he always made sure she ate before he did. The way he thanked her for every meal, as if good food were a gift rather than an expectation. The way he sometimes stood on the porch in the evening, staring out at the land with an expression of deep contentment. And she understood that this ranch was not just his livelihood but his soul made manifest. She noticed other things too. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, which was not often but always genuine. The way he moved, economical and graceful, never wasting energy on unnecessary gestures. The way he spoke to his men with respect and humor, creating a loyalty that went beyond wages. And the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, with a mixture of concern and something else, something warmer that made her pulse quicken. It was dangerous, she told herself. She had been at the ranch for barely 2 months, and she could not afford to confuse gratitude with anything deeper. James had saved her from a terrible situation, yes, but that did not mean he felt anything beyond basic human decency. And even if he did, what did she really know about him? He was kind and honorable, but he was also a man shaped by war and hardship, carrying scars she could only guess at. But knowing all that did not stop her heart from beating faster when he came into the kitchen in the morning, his hair still damp from washing, his eyes finding hers across the room. It did not stop her from looking forward to the evenings when the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and she and James were alone, talking about everything and nothing while the fire burned low. It did not stop her from lying awake in her locked room at night, wondering what it would be like to be touched by hands that were gentle instead of grasping, to be held by someone who saw her as a person rather than a possession. It was Charlie who first commented on the change, coming into the kitchen one morning with a knowing grin on his weathered face. "You are looking mighty healthy these days, Miss Eliza," he said as she handed him his breakfast. "Wyoming must agree with you." "It is the good food and clean air," Eliza said lightly, though she felt heat rising in her cheeks. "It is more than that." Charlie glanced toward where James was standing by the stove pouring coffee. "A happy housekeeper makes for a happy house. Then it is a good thing I am happy." Eliza turned back to the stove, but she could feel both men's eyes on her, and she wondered what they saw that she was trying so hard to hide. That afternoon, James rode out with Miguel to check on the herd in the north pasture, leaving Eliza alone for the first time in weeks. She took advantage of the solitude to give his bedroom a thorough cleaning, something she had been putting off because it felt too intimate, too much like crossing a line she had drawn for herself. But the room needed attention, and she was his housekeeper, so she gathered her supplies and climbed the stairs to the end of the hall. The door was unlocked, and she pushed it open to find a space that was purely functional, with a large bed covered in a plain blanket, a dresser with a shaving mirror above it, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. The only personal touch was a daguerreotype in a simple frame on the dresser, and Eliza found herself drawn to it despite her best intentions. The photograph showed a young woman, maybe 30, with dark hair and tired eyes, standing beside a gangly boy who had to be James. They both looked serious, the way people did in old photographs, but there was something in the way the woman's hand rested on the boy's shoulder that spoke of fierce love and fierce determination. This was his mother, Eliza realized, the woman who had scrubbed floors until she died, and James kept her picture where he would see it every morning and every night. Eliza felt her throat tighten with emotion. She understood now why he had helped her, why he had looked at her bleeding knees and seen something that demanded action. He was not trying to save her. He was trying to honor the mother he had been unable to save, and that understanding changed something in her, softened some hard place in her heart that she had been protecting for too long. She cleaned the room quickly and carefully, washing the windows and sweeping the floor and changing the linens on his bed. She did not touch the photograph or look through his belongings, respecting his privacy even though he was not there to see. And when she was finished, she stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the space and thinking about the man who slept here, the man who had given her back her life and asked for nothing in return. James returned just before supper, dusty and tired but in good spirits. "The herd looks strong," he told her as he washed his hands at the pump outside. "We should have a good year if the weather holds." "That is wonderful." Eliza set a plate of fried chicken and potatoes in front of him, along with fresh bread and butter. "You work very hard for this place." "It is worth working hard for." James took a bite and sighed with pleasure. "This is delicious, Eliza. You have spoiled us. I do not know how we ever survived without you. You would have managed somehow." But Eliza felt pleased by the compliment, by the simple appreciation in his voice. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and then James said, "I went into your room today, to clean it. I hope that was all right." Eliza looked up, surprised. "It is your house. You can go anywhere you want." "No, it is your room. I gave you the lock for a reason." James set down his fork. "I just wanted you to know in case it made you uncomfortable." "It does not." Eliza hesitated, then added, "I saw the photograph of your mother. She looked like a strong woman." James's expression softened. "She was the strongest person I have ever known. She should have had an easier life." "We should all have easier lives, I think, but we work with what we are given." "Is that what you are doing, working with what you were given?" "I am trying to." Eliza met his eyes across the table. "You gave me a chance to do that. You gave me back my dignity. That is not a small thing." "You never lost your dignity, Eliza. It was just hidden under circumstances that were not your fault." James reached across the table, then seemed to think better of it and pulled his hand back. "I want you to know that you are not just my housekeeper. You are part of this place now. You belong here." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow, so unexpected and so needed that she felt tears welling up. She had not belonged anywhere since her mother died, had not felt rooted or safe or wanted, and hearing James say those words made something crack open inside her that she had been keeping carefully sealed. "Thank you," she whispered, and this time James did not tell her to stop. August turned to September, and the nights grew cooler as summer reluctantly gave way to autumn. The men brought the herd down from the high pastures, and there was a week of controlled chaos as they prepared for the cattle drive that would take a portion of the herd to market in Cheyenne. James would be going with them, along with Charlie and Frank, while Miguel and young Tom stayed behind to manage the ranch. "We will be gone for about 10 days, James explained to Eliza a few days before they were set to leave. "Miguel is in charge while I am away, and if you need anything at all, go to him. But you should be safe here. This is good land with good neighbors, and everyone knows this ranch is under my protection." "I will be fine," Eliza assured him, though the thought of him being gone for 10 days created an odd hollow feeling in her chest that she did not want to examine too closely. "Just be careful on the drive. I have heard stories about stampedes and river crossings. I have been doing this for years. I know how to handle cattle and trouble." But James looked pleased by her concern. "Just keep the place running and I will be back before you know it." They left at dawn on a Monday, the cattle lowing and restless as the men drove them out of the corrals and onto the trail. Eliza stood on the porch and watched them go, James sitting tall in his saddle, his hat pulled low against the rising sun. At the last moment, he turned and raised his hand to her, and she waved back, feeling foolish and lonely and more confused about her feelings than ever. The days without James were strange. The house felt too big and too quiet, even with Miguel and Tom coming in for meals. She threw herself into projects to keep busy, making preserves from the last of the summer fruit, and sewing new curtains for the parlor and reorganizing the kitchen. But in the evenings, when the work was done and she sat alone by the fire, she found herself missing James with an intensity that frightened her. She missed his quiet presence and his rare smiles. She missed the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if her words mattered. She missed the sound of his footsteps on the porch and the way he always hung his hat on the same peg by the door. She missed him, and the depth of that missing told her something she had been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with him. The realization came to her one night as she sat alone in the parlor, mending one of his shirts by lamplight. Her needle moved automatically through the fabric, closing a torn seam, and she thought about how much of her life now revolved around caring for James and his men, how much satisfaction she took from feeding them and keeping their home comfortable. But it was more than just satisfaction in a job well done. When she cooked James's favorite meals or made sure his clothes were clean and mended, she was performing acts of love, small and quiet but no less real for being unspoken. She loved him. She loved his integrity and his kindness, and the way he had looked at her on that terrible day in the saloon and decided she was worth saving. She loved the shadows he carried and the light he brought despite them. She loved the life he had built here, the way he treated his men like family and his land like a sacred trust. She loved him, and the knowledge was terrifying because she had no idea if he felt anything beyond gratitude and responsibility toward her. When the men returned 9 days later, dusty and exhausted but triumphant, Eliza was waiting on the porch. She saw James first, still in the saddle even though he looked ready to collapse, and their eyes met across the yard with an intensity that made her breath catch. He dismounted and walked toward her, and she saw something in his face that had not been there before, a kind of determination that made her heart race. "We got a good price," he said when he reached the porch steps. The herd was strong and the buyers were eager. It was a successful drive. "I am glad." Eliza twisted her hands in her apron, suddenly nervous. "You look exhausted. Come inside and I will make you something to eat. In a minute." James climbed the steps until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the dust on his clothes and the lines of fatigue around his eyes. "I need to tell you something first." "All right." The whole drive, all I could think about was getting back here. "Not to the ranch, but to you." James spoke quickly, as if afraid he would lose his courage if he slowed down. "I missed you, Eliza, more than I thought possible, and I realized something while I was gone. I do not want you here just as my housekeeper. I want you here as more than that. I want a chance to court you to see if what I am feeling might be something you feel too." Eliza stared at him, her mind racing. "James, if you do not feel the same, I understand," he continued, still in that same rush of words. "You can stay on as housekeeper, and I will never mention this again. Your job is safe either way, but I had to tell you because keeping it inside was driving me crazy and you deserve to know the truth. James." Eliza reached out and laid her hand on his chest, feeling his heart pounding beneath her palm. "Let me talk." He fell silent, his gray eyes fixed on her face with an expression of such vulnerability that it made her ache. "I missed you too," Eliza said softly. "Every day you were gone, I missed you. And I realized that somewhere between that first day in the saloon and now, I stopped seeing you as just my employer. I started seeing you as a man I could care about, a man I do care about, Eliza." James covered her hand with his own, his fingers warm and rough against her skin. "Are you saying?" "I am saying yes." She smiled up at him, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes, you can court me. Yes, I feel the same. Yes to whatever this is between us, because I want to find out where it leads." For a moment, James just stood there looking stunned, as if he had not actually expected her to say yes. Then slowly, carefully, he raised his free hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin with a gentleness that made her eyes close. "I will do this right," he promised. "I will take my time and treat you the way you deserve to be treated. No rushing, no assumptions. Just honest courting the way people are supposed to do it." "That sounds perfect." Eliza opened her eyes and found him smiling at her with such pure joy that she felt her heart overflow. "Now come inside and let me feed you. You look like you have not eaten properly in days." "I have not." But James did not move, his hand still cradling her face as if she were something precious. "Thank you, Eliza, for saying yes, for giving me a chance. Thank you for asking." Eliza leaned into his touch for just a moment longer, then stepped back before the intimacy became too much. "Now, inside. Food first, and then you can sleep for 12 hours if you need to." James laughed and followed her into the house, and behind them, Eliza heard Miguel and the other men making knowing noises. Let them, she thought. Let the whole world know that something had shifted between her and James, that they were no longer just employer and employee, but something far more complicated and infinitely more precious. The courting began slowly, carefully, as if they were both afraid of moving too fast and breaking the fragile thing growing between them. James brought her wildflowers from the prairie, awkward bouquets of sage and columbine that she arranged in jars on the kitchen windowsill. They took walks in the evening after the men had retired to the bunkhouse, strolling through the grassland while the stars came out overhead and talking about their lives, their dreams, their fears. Eliza learned that James had taught himself to read from his mother's Bible, that he could recite whole passages from memory even though he had lost his faith somewhere in the war. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, waking up gasping from dreams of battles and death, and that the ranch was his way of proving to himself that he could create life instead of taking it. She learned that his favorite color was the blue of the sky just after sunset, and that he had never been in love before, never met anyone who made him want to build a future beyond the next season. James learned that Eliza had wanted to be a teacher since she was a child, that she loved learning and believed education could change lives. He learned that she missed her mother every day, missed the smell of her perfume and the sound of her laugh, and that guilt over leaving her aunt still kept her awake some nights. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, that the months in Cheyenne had not broken her, but instead had taught her the difference between surviving and living. He learned that she sang while she cooked, old songs from her childhood, and that the sound of her voice made his house feel like a home. They courted through the autumn as the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter. James taught her to ride properly, patient and encouraging as she relearned the skills from her childhood. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons, his horse and hers moving side by side across the grassland, and he showed her the boundaries of his land, the places where his dreams had taken physical form. One afternoon, they rode to the top of a ridge that overlooked the entire ranch, and James dismounted to help her down, his hands lingering on her waist. "This is my favorite spot," he said, gesturing to the view spread out below them. "When I first came here, I stood right here and decided this was where I would build my life. It seemed impossible at the time. I had no money, no cattle, just a dream and a lot of stubborn determination. But I made it happen. You should be proud." Eliza stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "This is an incredible achievement. It is empty without someone to share it with." James turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I built this place thinking it was enough, that if I worked hard enough and earned enough, I would be satisfied. But then you came and I realized I had been lying to myself. A ranch is not a life. It is just land and cattle. You are life, Eliza. Your laughter and your kindness and the way you make everything better just by being part of it, that is what I was missing." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. "James, that is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me. It is the truth." He took her hands in his grip strong and sure. I love you, Eliza. I think I started loving you that first day in the saloon when you looked up at me with all that determination and pain in your eyes, and it has only grown stronger every day since. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much. I love you too. The words came easily, naturally, as if she had been waiting her whole life to say them to him. I was so afraid to admit it, afraid I was confusing gratitude with love. But it is real. What I feel for you is real, and it is the most terrifying and wonderful thing I have ever experienced. James pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as the wind swept around them and the autumn sun painted everything gold. Eliza pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt safe in a way she had never felt before. This was right. He was right. And whatever future they built together, it would be built on a foundation of honesty and respect and genuine love. When James finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. Marry me, Eliza, not today or tomorrow, but when you are ready. Let me make you my wife. Let us build a life together, a real life with children and laughter and all the things we have both been denied for too long. Yes. Eliza smiled up at him through her tears. Yes, I will marry you, whenever you want, wherever you want. Yes. James kissed her then, a soft, careful kiss that held all the promise of the future they would share. It was Eliza's first real kiss, the first one given and received with love rather than taken by force or given out of desperation, and it felt like coming home after a long journey. They were married in late October, on a bright cold day when the aspens were shedding their last golden leaves, and the mountains stood white against the blue sky. The ceremony took place in the small church in Cheyenne, with Miguel and Charlie and Frank and young Tom as witnesses, and the circuit preacher who came through once a month to minister to the scattered ranching families. Eliza wore a new dress that James had insisted on buying for her, a simple but elegant gown of deep green wool that matched her eyes, and she carried a bouquet of the last wildflowers of the season. James wore his best suit, dark and well-cut, his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. He looked nervous and happy and impossibly handsome, and when he took her hand at the altar, Eliza felt her heart swell with so much love she thought it might burst. I, James Cordell, take you, Eliza Brennan, to be my wedded wife, he said, his voice steady and sure. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. I, Eliza Brennan, take you, James Cordell, to be my wedded husband, Eliza replied, her own voice strong despite her tears. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and James kissed her with a passion that made the men whistle and cheer, and Eliza laughed against his mouth, deliriously happy. This was real. This was forever. This was the life she had dreamed of when she stepped off that train so many months ago, and it was better than anything she could have imagined. They had a small celebration at the ranch that evening, with music and dancing and food that Eliza had spent days preparing. Miguel played a guitar and Charlie sang in a surprisingly good tenor, and young Tom danced with such enthusiasm that he nearly knocked over the punch bowl. James held Eliza close as they danced, his arms around her waist, his cheek against her hair, and she thought she had never been so perfectly, completely happy. When the guests finally left and they were alone, James carried her over the threshold of the house in the traditional way, and Eliza clung to him, laughing and crying at the same time. He carried her up the stairs to his room, their room now, and set her down gently beside the bed. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "A little," Eliza admitted, "but not afraid, never afraid with you." "Good." James kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then finally her mouth, slow and deep and full of promise. "I love you, Eliza Cordell. I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you know it." That night, in the big bed with the moonlight streaming through the window, James made love to his wife with a tenderness that erased all of Eliza's fears and insecurities. He was patient and careful, making sure she was comfortable, making sure she felt loved and cherished rather than used. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in the darkness, Eliza felt transformed, as if she had finally become the person she was always meant to be. The winter that followed was the happiest time of Eliza's life. The ranch slowed down in the cold months, with the cattle moved to winter pasture and the men spending more time on maintenance and repairs than actual herding. James was around the house more, helping with chores and stealing kisses when he thought the men were not looking, and Eliza loved the domesticity of it, the simple pleasure of sharing a life with someone who loved her. They talked about the future during those long winter evenings, sitting together by the fire while the wind howled outside. James wanted to expand the herd, maybe buy some of the land to the east that was coming up for sale. Eliza wanted to start a small school on the ranch, teaching the children of the neighboring families who were too far from town to attend regular school. They both wanted children of their own, a whole house full of them, and they laughed about whether they would be cowboys or scholars or some impossible combination of both. "They will be perfect no matter what," James said one night, his hand resting on Eliza's still flat stomach. "Because they will be ours." "You are assuming I am already pregnant," Eliza teased, though secretly she hoped he was right. She wanted to give James children, wanted to see him be a father and know that he would be everything his own father had not been. "I am an optimist." James kissed her long and slow. "And if you are not yet, we can certainly keep trying." Spring came eventually, bringing green grass and new calves and the endless work of a working ranch. Eliza threw herself into the rhythm of it, cooking and cleaning and managing the household, while James and the men worked from dawn to dusk. And in May, when the wildflowers were blooming across the prairie, Eliza realized that her monthly courses had not come and that the fatigue she had been feeling was not just from hard work. She was pregnant. She told James that evening, unable to wait any longer, the words tumbling out before he had even taken off his hat. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." James froze in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock. Then he let out a whoop of pure joy and swept her up into his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "A baby," he kept saying, over and over. "We are going to have a baby." "Put me down before you make me sick," Eliza protested, but she was laughing too, caught up in his happiness. James set her down carefully, his hands immediately going to her stomach with a reverence that made her eyes sting. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need to rest?" "Should you be working so hard?" "I am fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, and most of them kept working right up until the end." But Eliza was touched by his concern. "I will be careful, I promise, but I am not going to spend the next 7 months sitting in a chair." "At least let me hire someone to help you. You should not be doing all this work alone, especially now." They compromised. James hired a girl from town, a sweet 16-year-old named Lucy whose family had fallen on hard times, to come 3 days a week to help with the heavy cleaning and laundry. Lucy was shy but eager to learn, and Eliza enjoyed having another woman around, someone to talk to during the long days when James was out with the herd. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. Eliza's belly grew round and full, and she felt the baby move inside her, little flutters at first and then stronger kicks that James loved to feel with his hand pressed against her skin. He was attentive to the point of being overprotective, worrying about her constantly, making sure she ate enough and rested enough and did not lift anything heavy. "I am not made of glass," Eliza told him one evening in late October when she was 8 months along and feeling ungainly and impatient. "Women have been doing this forever. Not my wife." James kissed her forehead. "My wife gets to be pampered and worried over whether she likes it or not." "I suppose there are worse problems to have," Eliza admitted, leaning back against him as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "But James, you need to understand something. When my time comes, it will be dangerous. Childbirth is always dangerous, especially out here where the nearest doctor is an hour away. I need you to promise me that if something goes wrong, you will save the baby. Do you understand? The baby comes first. Nothing is going to go wrong. James's arms tightened around her, his voice fierce. I am not losing you, Eliza. I just found you. You and the baby will both be fine. Promise me anyway. No. James turned her to face him, his eyes burning with determination. I will not promise that. I will not choose between you. So you will just have to make sure you both come through safely, because I refuse to accept any other outcome. Eliza wanted to argue, but she saw the fear beneath his stubbornness and understood. He had lost his mother. He could not, accept the possibility of losing his wife too. So she simply nodded and let him hold her, and prayed that his faith in a positive outcome would be justified. The baby came on a cold November night, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Eliza woke to cramping pain and the wet rush of her water breaking, and she lay in the darkness for a moment, trying to decide if she was frightened or excited or both. Then another contraction hit, stronger this time, and she reached over to shake James awake. The baby is coming, she said, proud that her voice stayed steady. James was out of bed and half-dressed before she finished the sentence, moving with the quick efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. He helped her into a clean nightgown, got her settled in bed with plenty of pillows, and then sent young Tom riding hard for the midwife in town while he stayed with Eliza, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next morning. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, arrived just after dawn and took charge immediately, examining Eliza and declaring that everything was progressing normally. But normally still meant hours of pain, waves of contractions that left Eliza gasping and sweating, and James stayed with her through all of it, letting her grip his hand hard enough to bruise, murmuring encouragement and love even when she was too far gone to really hear him. Finally, just after noon, Mrs. Henderson said, "All right, dear, it is time to push. When the next contraction comes, you push as hard as you can." Eliza bore down with all her strength, feeling as if she were being split in two, and somewhere in the haze of pain she heard James's voice saying, "You can do this, Eliza. You are the strongest person I know. You can do this." She pushed again, and then suddenly there was a release of pressure and a thin, angry wail filled the room. Eliza collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced, and watched through blurry eyes as Mrs. Henderson held up a squirming, bloody baby. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, smiling. "A healthy, strong boy." James was crying, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. "Eliza, we have a son. You did it. You gave me a son, Mrs." Henderson cleaned the baby quickly and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then laid him in Eliza's arms. She looked down at the tiny face, the closed eyes and the little mouth already rooting for food, and felt love slam into her with such force that she could barely breathe. This was her son. Hers and James's, this perfect, miraculous little person that they had made together. "Hello, baby," she whispered, touching his soft cheek. "Welcome to the world." They named him Samuel after Eliza's father, and he was baptized a month later in the same church where his parents had been married. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. James was besotted with him from the first moment, holding him whenever he could, talking to him in a gentle voice that Eliza had never heard him use before. "You are a natural father," she told him one evening, watching as he rocked Samuel to sleep. "I am trying to be everything my father was not." James kissed the baby's forehead. "This little one is going to grow up knowing he is loved and wanted. He will never doubt his worth." Eliza's heart swelled watching them together, her husband and her son, and she thought about how far she had come from that terrible day in the saloon. She had been scrubbing floors with bleeding knees, convinced that her life was over, that she would never be anything more than a woman who cleaned up other people's messes. And then James had pulled her up and said, "No more," and everything had changed. The years passed, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growing family. Samuel was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Margaret, a fierce little thing with her father's determination and her mother's intelligence. Then came another son, Thomas, and finally another daughter, Eleanor, until the house was full of noise and laughter and the happy chaos of children. Eliza did start her school, converting one of the empty bedrooms into a classroom and teaching not just her own children but the children of neighboring ranches. She loved it, loved passing on knowledge and watching young minds open to new ideas, and James was endlessly proud of her, bragging to anyone who would listen about his brilliant wife. The ranch prospered too. James expanded the herd and bought more land, and the Cordell Ranch became known throughout Wyoming Territory as a well-run operation that treated its workers fairly and produced quality cattle. Miguel stayed on, becoming foreman and then practically family, and young Tom grew into a capable cowboy who eventually married Lucy, the girl who had helped Eliza during her first pregnancy. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took Eliza back to the ridge where he had first told her he loved her. The children were with Miguel and his wife for the afternoon, and it was just the two of them, standing in the same spot where their future had truly begun. "Do you remember standing here?" James asked, his arm around her waist. "Of course. You told me you loved me, and I thought my heart was going to explode from happiness. I told you this place was empty without someone to share it with. Do you remember that?" James turned her to face him. "You have made it full, Eliza. Not just the ranch, but my whole life. Before you, I was just going through the motions, building something without really understanding why. You gave me purpose. You gave me a family. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything." Eliza reached up to touch his face, loving the lines that time and sun had carved around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair. "I was broken when you found me, James. I thought I would never be whole again. But you saw something in me worth saving, and you gave me the chance to become the person I was meant to be." "You saved yourself," James corrected gently. "I just gave you the opportunity. Then we saved each other." Eliza kissed him, soft and sweet and full of 10 years of love. "And we will keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." They stood there together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, and Eliza thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The pain and the fear, the desperate scrubbing of floors with bleeding knees, the moment when a cowboy had pulled her up and said "no more" and changed the course of her entire life. It had not been an easy road. There had been challenges and setbacks, hard winters and dry summers, children sick with fever and cattle lost to predators, and all the 1,000 difficulties that came with building a life on the frontier. But they had faced it all together, she and James, and they had emerged stronger for it. More years passed, and the children grew. Samuel showed an aptitude for ranching, learning everything he could from his father and Miguel, and by the time he was 18, he was running his own section of the herd. Margaret surprised everyone by becoming fascinated with medicine, devouring every book on anatomy and health that Eliza could order from back east. And eventually she went away to study nursing, one of the first women from Wyoming Territory to do so. Thomas had his mother's love of learning and became a teacher himself, taking over Eliza's school when she decided she wanted to spend more time writing. And Eleanor, the youngest, fell in love with a young rancher from Montana and married him in a ceremony even more beautiful than her parents' wedding. James and Eliza grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love only deepening with time. They sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing, comfortable in the silence that came from truly knowing another person. James still brought Eliza wildflowers every week, and she still made his favorite meals, and they still held hands when they walked, as if afraid that letting go meant losing each other. On a summer evening when James was 60 and Eliza 58, they sat together on that same porch, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Samuel had 3 children now, and Margaret had 2, and there were more grandchildren coming as Thomas and Alina started their own families. The ranch house was full of noise and life, 3 generations living and working together, and it was everything James and Eliza had dreamed of all those years ago. "Do you ever think about that day in the saloon?" Eliza asked suddenly, watching the children chase each other through the grass. "Every day," James said quietly. "It was the day my real life began. Mine too." Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was so lost, James, so convinced that I had made irreversible mistakes and that I would never find my way back to anything good. And then you appeared, like something out of a story, and you refused to let me keep destroying myself. I saw you, Eliza, really saw you. And I knew that someone that strong, that determined to keep going even when every reason to quit was staring her in the face, deserved better than what life had given her." James kissed the top of her head. "You deserved everything, and I wanted to be the one to give it to you. You gave me more than everything. You gave me a life worth living." They sat together as the light faded and the stars came out, watching their grandchildren and remembering all the years that had brought them to this moment. The house behind them was full of love and laughter, the land around them was prosperous and well-tended, and the family they had built together was strong and happy. It was a good life, Eliza thought. No, it was more than good. It was extraordinary, built from nothing but determination and love, and a cowboy who had looked at a woman scrubbing floors with bleeding knees, and decided that her story did not have to end that way. Years later, when James and Eliza had both passed into peaceful old age, their children and grandchildren gathered to remember them. They told stories about James's quiet strength and Eliza's fierce intelligence, about the love that had been visible in every glance they shared and every touch they exchanged. They talked about the ranch that James had built and the school that Eliza had started, about the legacy of kindness and hard work that they had passed down through the generations. But the story that everyone loved most, the one that got told and retold until it became family legend, was the story of how they met. How Eliza had been at her lowest point, scrubbing a saloon floor until her knees bled, convinced that her life was over. And how James had walked in, seen her suffering, and made a choice that changed both their lives forever. How he had pulled her to her feet and said, "No more." And how those 2 simple words had been the beginning of a love story that lasted 50 years and created a family that would endure for generations. It was a reminder, the children told their own children, that redemption was always possible. That even in your darkest moment, someone might appear to pull you up and show you that there was another way. That love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that the family you built was often more important than the family you were born into. And on quiet evenings, when the grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered on the porch of the ranch house that James had built and Eliza had made a home, they could almost feel the presence of their ancestors, still watching over the land they had loved and the family they had created. The porch creaked in the wind, the prairie grass whispered secrets, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed peacefully under the endless Wyoming sky. The Cordell Ranch endured, just as James and Eliza's love had endured, a testament to the power of second chances and the possibility of hope even in the darkest circumstances. And if you listened carefully on those quiet evenings, you might hear the echo of a cowboy's voice saying "no more" to suffering and pain, and a woman's voice answering with love and gratitude, their voices intertwined forever in the land they had made their own. The bleeding knees had healed long ago, but the memory of that moment, when James pulled Eliza up and changed the trajectory of her entire life, remained fresh and powerful, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest act of human kindness. It was a story of redemption and resilience, of finding love in unexpected places, and of building a future from the ruins of a broken past. And it was, above all, a story of two people who found each other when they both needed saving, and who spent the rest of their lives proving that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made new every single day. A choice to see the person in front of you, to honor their worth, to pull them up when they are down, and to say with absolute conviction, no more suffering, no more pain, no more darkness. From this moment forward, we face the world together. That was the legacy James and Eliza left behind, written not just in the land they had tended or the children they had raised, but in the very air of the ranch itself, where their love still lingered like a benediction, blessing all who came after them. It was a legacy of hope, of transformation, of the extraordinary things that could happen when one person looked at another and saw not what they were, but what they could become. The story ended, as all good stories must, but the love that had created it lived on, passed down through generations, as enduring and unchanging as the mountains that watched over the Cordell Ranch. And every time someone told the story of the woman who was scrubbing floors with bleeding knees and the cowboy who pulled her up and said, "No more," they were reminded that the greatest adventures often begin with the smallest acts of courage, and that true love was always worth fighting for, worth building on, worth cherishing until the very end.